Good afternoon. Here's another little story. This one's called The Stradivarius. You know, it's all too easy to do the wrong thing for the right reason and end up skiing straight down the brown run from the moral high ground into the snowdrift of deep doo-doos. So it was when I tried to do an old friend a favour back in '93. Toby, I always called him Toby, although his real name was Darrell, but he reminded me of a Toby jug that my great-aunt used to have that was supposed to be George VI, but actually looked just like Darrell. Anyway, Toby had a Stradivarius. It was a Stradivarius trombone, one of the very few trombones that Stradivarius ever made, and thus quite extraordinarily rare, although of course it sounded awful, because Stradivarius, who really only knew how to do violins, had made it out of wood, with the result that the slide in and out thing kept sticking and you got splinters every time you tried to do the high bit in Moon River. "Let me grease it for you," I'd said, helpfully, repeatedly. "Just leave the bloody thing alone," he'd said, stubbornly, and often. Well, one day, Toby was up before the bench. It was a silly business, really. He'd noticed that the church bell wasn't ringing quite right, and he'd taken it home to grease the clapper. But the vicar completely misunderstood this kind gesture, which was unfortunate, especially after Toby had gone to all the trouble to borrow a crane. And that was a separate case. They heard that the following week. Anyway, whilst he was in court, I thought, now's my chance to do a chap a favour. And I whipped out my trusty tin of WD-40 and got lubricating. Well, who would have thought that 18th century varnish would react so badly to a few squirts of industrial solvent? To begin with, it was all going very well. I puckered up and did Alexander's Ragtime Band just like a professional. A professional blacksmith, it's true, but what I lacked in expertise I made up for by stamping on the floor, and pretty soon everyone in that block of flats was thumping the walls, the ceilings, their children, along with me, and I hadn't felt such a sense of community since the Queen's Jubilee, when we all got together and had a street party in the beer aisle at Sainsbury's. It was when I tried to play Bat Out of Hell that the problems really began. I just got to the bit where it goes, "And like a sinner, honk! Before the gates of heaven, I'll come crawling on back to you. Honk! 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 Honk!" When the slide jammed up absolutely solid. I tried pushing it, pulling it, putting the bell end in a sink and hitting it with a saucepan, which was a trick matron showed me at school, although that was under rather different circumstances. But nothing would shift it, and that was when I remembered a little wheeze that my grandfather had picked up out east. Apparently, they'd got an elephant stuck in the tradesman's entrance to the Maharaja's palace. You know, youthful high spirits, we've all been there. And they got it out by basting it with jelly and holding a currant bun just out of reach of its trunk. I believe it was raspberry jelly, and I only had tangerine, but I thought under the circumstances the flavour probably wasn't that important. So I rubbed the jelly onto the trombone, and for want of a currant bun, rammed half a Battenberg inside it. Well, I don't know what my grandfather was thinking. It didn't help. If anything, it just made it worse. I knew then I was just going to have to get a bit industrial with the thing, so nailing the mouth end very gently to the dining table, I started tapping the slide with a small hammer. Now, you have to know what you're doing when you start hitting a 250-year-old musical instrument with a hammer, even a little one, but since I didn't, I'd pretty soon smashed it all to buggery and wrenched a leg off the dining table in the process. It was about then, just as I was wondering whether the scratches would polish out, that I heard the distinctive sound of a man coming home with a restraining order, a £5 fine, an impounded crane, and an attitude that could make a statue soil itself. I was sort of hoping that he wouldn't notice, or at least wouldn't mind. It's not as though he ever played the thing, well, not that often anyway, apart from the proms. But rather than seeing the funny side of it, he started weeping uncontrollably and holding the pieces of broken wood up to his cheeks, which was a bit embarrassing, frankly. So I tried to cheer him up by offering to pop down the Co-op for a tube of Yoo-hoo, pointing out it would be much easier to clean all the jelly and cake off it now it was all in bits, and then, when I glued it back together, I'd be able to make sure it worked properly. But unfortunately, he was just in one of those irascible sort of moods where he wasn't interested in hearing anything other than the sound of himself pulling my head off my neck with his cold, clammy hands. So there was nothing for it but to whack him in the ghoulies with the leg off the table, nip out the bathroom window, and go and live rough in a Neolithic burial chamber on Dartmoor for a few years. It wasn't too bad. Luckily, I'd picked up a lot of survival skills during my time with the Navajo, hiding out from the mob after a big pasta heist went down. It wasn't my fault. We were dumped on by a stool pigeon, but the mob don't do excuses, and well, that's another story.